Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to welcome you as we celebrate 10 years of the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation. When the Alliance was founded in 2015, it began with a simple but powerful idea. Trade facilitation can be delivered differently. The WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement that had just been signed was the perfect moment to turn theory into practice. Trade facilitation drives growth, especially in developing countries, boosting competitiveness, attracting investment, and creating jobs through streamlined customs and digital tools. And that's why the Alliance was created, to bring governments, the private sector, and development partners together as equal, co-designing and delivering reforms hand in hand. The public-private model makes us unique by being agile, practical, and focused, qualities that are vital to remain effective as global trade evolves. We're deeply grateful to our donors, the United States, Canada, Germany, the United Kingdom, Australia, Denmark, the European Union, and Sweden, who all have helped us shape and expand our impact worldwide over the years. We're thankful to our host organizations, the World Economic Forum, the International Chamber of Commerce, the Center for International Private Enterprise, and GIZ, for their leadership and support in creating and sustaining this alliance over the years. And of course, our thanks goes to our business partners, logistics pioneers like Maersk, DHL, and Agility, consumer and retail icons such as IKEA, Walmart, or H&M, and technology, industrial, and pharmaceutical innovators such as Cisco, BASF, Abbott, and others. Together, we've helped over 25 countries cut time, costs at borders, saving more than $200 million in trade costs. But beyond the numbers, our impact means stronger economies, new opportunities, more inclusive growth. Trade facilitation also supports broader global objectives, from food security and climate resilience to humanitarian response, as we have seen in our work with UNICEF. As we celebrate 10 years, our model remains as relevant as ever, adaptable, innovative, and focused on measurable impact. So as we look back and ahead, let's begin our first conversation. From lessons learned to success stories, 10 years of building trade reform. On this panel today, I am delighted to welcome leaders from both government and private sector to share their thoughts. Firstly, welcome to Nadia Theodore, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Canada to WTO and other international organizations. Sarah Meinert, who is joining us online, who is the head of Go Trade at DHL. And our own Laura Escalante, who is a Senior Program Manager for the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation. Welcome to you.
Thank you.
Ambassador, let me start with you. Canada has been a founding member of the Alliance 10 years ago and has been very active over the years in supporting aid for trade. But as we see, trade has gone through major shifts and the development landscape is evolving with time. From your perspective, what are some of the most significant changes or milestones that have shaped how trade facilitation and development work today?
Well, listen, first, thank you for having me. And congratulations on the 10-year anniversary. It's such a pleasure for me personally and on behalf of Canada to be here to have this conversation and to celebrate a milestone with you all. And I think, you know, what you said at the top to me is so poignant as we kind of look forward in terms of what the milestones have been. And you said that the idea of creating the alliance was really about turning theory into practice. And in my view, and in Canada's view, that is indeed the biggest milestone that we can celebrate in the past few years. This idea of really taking what we know in terms of theory and turning that theory into practice. And, you know, certainly because I am, as you said, Canada's ambassador to the World Trade Organization, I am, of course, going to talk about a milestone that is related to trade policy, to trade agreements. And from our perspective, the WTO agreement on trade facilitation is indeed one of those milestones that we should be celebrating, one of those concrete institutions, so to speak, and instruments that have really allowed us to turn theory into practice. The agreement itself recognizes the fact that in order to facilitate trade, in particular for developing countries, we need to be able to expedite things. We need to be able to create certainty. We need to be able to have developing and least developed countries have control over some of the processes that they need to have in place in order to facilitate their access to global markets. And the Trade Facilitation Agreement was a first agreement of its kind that was able to do that. So from our perspective, that is indeed a milestone that should be celebrated.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to you in a minute. Online, we have Sarah Meinert, who represents DHL. DHL was also a founding member of the Alliance, and let's just say it out and clear, DHL has been the biggest supporter from the private sector of the Alliance over the years. Sarah, just would like to thank you for all your support over the years. The model of the Alliance is all about bringing together government, private sector, and development partners. And a key role of the private sector is perhaps to change the mindset of how development is delivered. Tell us about, from your perspective, what are the learnings over the past 10 years, and how does DHL perceive this model?
Yeah, thank you so much, Philippe, also for the invite. And just to also add on what the ambassador just said, what the Alliance has shown is really a paradigm shift. Trade is not only seen as an economic lever, but also as a development enabler. It's a tool for job creation and poverty reduction, and also, of course, access to goods. And what we've done with the Alliance is really moving away from these aid-driven models to a partnership-based development. And here, and you mentioned it already, the private sector is not longer a bystander, but also, together with the countries we're in the Alliance, really a partner for creating solutions together. So what makes these partnerships really work is, foremost, is trust amongst the partners. We need to have shared goals. And of course, the beauty of it, we complement each other in our strength. So government bring policy frameworks, regulatory authority, and the private sector, for example, brings the operational expertise, the innovation, and also the real-time insights, what's really happening on the ground. And as said, the partnership is really most effective when it's locally grounded. And what we learned also that the co-creation, that's the really important part. It's not the top-down anymore. It's the key to success, also to make it sustainable. As well, what we have seen over the years is this continuous dialogue is essential. It's not a one-off consultation, but really an ongoing relationship we have as an alliance in the countries that also adapts to changing realities. We also see over the years, and quite recently, even quicker. So when all sides, all partners are really equally invested in what we are doing, we see the fast implementation, better outcomes, and also more sustainable reforms. So it's not only about implementing the reforms, but really unlocking lasting change.
Thank you, Sarah. And I have a couple more questions for you later. Let me move on to Laura. Laura, you are one of our senior project managers. You've been with the Alliance for the past 5 years. You have seen projects in all parts of the world. What are the key lessons that you have learned over the years, and specifically, focusing on reforms? And how do we make sure that the reforms that we bring to bear are sustainable over time?
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity, Philippe. We usually spend too much time busy with project execution. We don't spend too much time thinking about it, and it's really important to do it. So this is a great opportunity for that. I think the answer to your question is twofold. First, I think from what I've seen in the projects, that the projects that are more sustainable, that have more possibilities of having reforms that will stay longer and are solid, are the ones that first that have a bigger sense of ownership between the private sector and the government of each country that we are working in, right? If the idea of the project comes from the local stakeholders, if it holds a very, let's say, close tie with the strategic decisions and the path that this country wants to take, whether it's in export promotion, whether it's in investment attraction. If it really makes sense for them, there is much more possibilities of success and permanence, let's say. And the second part, which is not less important, maybe even more important, and Sarah commented on this, is the continuity that the private sector brings to the projects. When the private sector is involved in the project and they own the solutions and they own part of the work that has been done with the reforms that we do in governments, there is more possibility of success, because governments change, policies change, but the private sector stays there. The private sector will continue working for the evolution of the economy, and so their role in shaping long-term reforms is invaluable.
That's a great point. I mean, using the private sector as a way of ensuring sustainability over the years in different countries, I think is a very key point. Ambassador, let me come back to you, and coming back to the notion of partnerships. Sarah provided us a perspective from the private sector. From a government perspective, working with the private sector is not always natural, and sometimes has to be forced a little bit. From a Canada perspective, what has your experience been in terms of collaborating with the private sector as a way to be more effective in the reforms that you want to bring?
I have no idea what you mean. It's always easy collaborating between private and public sectors. No, I mean, in all seriousness, you're absolutely right. I do think, listen, we have gotten better with time. But certainly, it is human nature and certainly institutional nature to kind of find your silo and stay within that. And so indeed, both the public sector and the private sector has had to be pushed a little bit into deeper collaboration. And I really love, I can't remember who said it, but the word ownership, because I do indeed think that part of what has helped us to really lean into true partnership is to understand and accept that each of us, the public sector, the private sector, and the actual entrepreneurs and developing country agents on the ground, each has a piece of ownership in the project, right? And when you find that piece of ownership that is yours, and then are able to translate what the other pieces, what the other partners can do to help you in that ownership, that is where the true magic is. And for Canada, we have really taken the approach, even from an institutional perspective. So I'll give you a very concrete example. Our Foreign Affairs Ministry, for example, is actually called Global Affairs Canada, and is made up of three main branches, so to speak: trade, foreign policy, and development. And that was done over 10 years ago, consequently, right around the time of the creation of the alliance, in recognition of the fact that there does need to be more of a partnership between trade, between development, and between, core kind of traditional foreign policy. And so for us, this idea of partnership is really grounded in the idea that if each one plays its role, and if we find what we can contribute to each other's roles on the ground and institutionally, we can go farther faster.
Wonderful. Sarah, let me come back to you from a private sector perspective. I wanted to ask you this question earlier on, but I'll ask it now. At the Alliance, we work with about 50 multinationals around the world, with 400 or 500 SMEs and local companies around the world. As I mentioned, DHL has been, our best supporter, our biggest supporter over the years. The private sector benefits from trade facilitation, but I always say the private sector also has got a responsibility to contribute to development. In your view, what is the DHL recipe, and how can we use that recipe to convince more private sector companies to invest in development?
Well, if you take it quite literally, we take the SMEs, if you broaden and enlarge the pie, also the slice of us and our business gets bigger. So there's a simple truth to that. So if we, from a private sector point of view, also support trade facilitation, or in this case, entrepreneurs, the likelihood that we also benefit from a business point of view is, of course, higher. And as you mentioned already, it's also quite a responsibility. So we are in 220 countries and territories. And everyone who's working, our 600,000 plus employees, are also citizens of those countries. So it's quite a responsibility that comes to with that as well, to be a good corporate citizen as well in these kind of countries. And there it really makes sense to look into what can we do from a sustainable point of view, but also, of course, we are still a private sector company. We are not an NGO, so it also needs to make business sense. And what we have seen, especially in the alliance, or what we are doing with DHL Go Trade program, that it benefits both sides, and that's really the beauty of it. And one point I probably would like to mention, because the ambassador mentioned the ownership, right? What we also should not forget that it's really also embedding the change and the implementation into systems and mindsets. We should not forget about the mindset change. That also needs to come with any reform we are working on. Because in the end, we are working on systems, but we also work with human beings. And that's also something we always need to keep in mind, and what we always doing also in the Alliance, right? It's also about capacity building. It's not only the technical part. And that's next to the ownership is also quite essential for making projects a success.
Time is running, but last question maybe for you, Laura, just coming back to this relationship between private sector and government. We have been at it for 10 years now. We have observed that some countries are more, let's say, advanced than others in terms of having private sector working in collaboration with government. From your perspective as a project manager, what do you think is the key to success in bringing government and private sector to really work together in a positive manner?
I think it's our role as an honest broker, Philippe. When we come to the projects, we gain the trust of the government and the private sector, and they can see through our work that we are not biased. We are not trying to benefit one of them, over the other. But we are there to help them talk to each other. Sometimes we have to be mediators. Sometimes we are doing conflict resolution when we work with them, and that is okay. At the end of the project, and this is something that is not just our perception. We have been able to measure it. We have end surveys for our projects, and we can report in some of these countries that we have been working on. For example, in Malawi, the project stakeholders reported that their trust in their counterparts, whether it's government and private sector, increased. 80% of the stakeholders mentioned that. In Colombia, 66% of the stakeholders reported an increase in the trust they have, vis-a-vis their counterparts. In Cambodia, 78% of the stakeholders reported increased trust. And so this is what we bring to the table, that we are going to be fair, that we're going to be responsible in bringing, both their ideas to the table, validate their role, as the ambassador mentioned. And this is what I think the alliance it's one of our most strongest characteristics.
Thank you, Laura. We're coming to the end of this first session. I would like to thank all the panelists for your thoughtful reflections. The first discussion has painted a vivid picture of just how much the global trade and development landscape has evolved over the past decade. We've heard how changing priorities, lessons learned, and on-the-ground collaboration have shaped the Alliance's journey. What stands out most is the consistency of purpose. No matter how much the context has shifted, the drive to make trade simpler, faster, and more inclusive has remained constant. And as we close this session, one message is clear. Our success has been built on the foundations of partnership and trust. With that in mind, let's now look at the future. The next conversation will explore how trade facilitation continues to evolve in a world that's changing faster than ever, a world shaped by new technologies, sustainability goals, and shifting geopolitical realities. How do we carry forward the lessons of the past decade to navigate what comes next? Thank you very much. Welcome to our second discussion, Navigating the Future, Innovation, Inclusion and Impact. Please join me in welcoming our next panel of distinguished speakers. Dr. Fan Sito, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Kenya to the UN, WTO and other international organizations. Keika Lee, Director for Public Affairs, Inter-IKEA Group, who is joining us from Shanghai. And Ana Libertad Guzman Vileda, Counselor, Permanent Mission of Guatemala to the WTO. Ambassador, let me start with you. Kenya has been an engine, a leader in trade facilitation on the African continent over the years. But today's trade environment is marked by shifting geopolitics, new trade realities, and increasing supply chain pressures. So from your perspective, how do you see these dynamics reshaping priorities for trade facilitation and development cooperation?
Thank you so much for the invitation and pleasure to be part of this very critical discussion this morning. It's true that there are many dynamics that have caused a lot of rethinking about everything, really, if we were to be very candid. Whether you talk about pandemic-induced global economic contractions, or you talk about the current geopolitics that are perhaps more alive than we ever thought before, there are tensions within the supply chains, which has meant that we need to demand or expect stronger focus on resilience. Governments all over, whether you talk about those in Africa or in other parts of the world, have been forced to rethink how to manage borders, logistics, and equally the issues of security. Trade facilitation becomes very, very, very integral if you really to ensure there is economic growth and stability in the long run. And of course, to deal with these dynamics, the focus has shifted, as you correctly asked. There is a more desire to see predictability, to see more trust. Countries now prefer to see faster, to see safer, to see more transparent trade systems. The older way of doing things has changed. Paper-based approach, procedures, outdated risk systems no longer really serve the purpose. And therefore, there is a deliberate effort to try and embrace modern customs technology, digital documentations, and as well as real-time data sharing for purposes of being able to really deal with the challenges that we have. But I think looking more critically, two things also are worth noting. One is there is a growing collaboration between the public and private sectors. Both sides now see the value in the shared trade system. But in the African space, like most of the other parts of the world, we've been forced to rethink what do we do to overcome the disruptions which were introduced by the current geopolitics. And another thing that we have done is to rethink our regional integration. Regional collaborations really is gaining momentum. A key example is the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement that was signed that will and is going to shape how Africa is going to engage. We appreciate now the need to trade more amongst ourselves within the African trade. Perhaps in the older days, we took it for granted that you can be able to engage with the global players with a lot of ease to take your products to the far areas, despite the challenges we had at that particular point. But because of these dynamics, I think there's a realization that we can be able to do more, and we are taking practical steps to be able to really, really make this particular agreement, for example, become a reality within our borders.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Keika, let me move over to you. You are representing the private sector on this panel. IKEA is one of the more recent joiners to the Global Alliance, but you have been very active in the past couple of years working with us in a number of countries around the world. Looking forward, how do you see the involvement of the private sector in traditional development and in particular in relation to trade facilitation?
Well, thank you for having me. I think when it comes to this topic, I mean, we're very happy to be part of the Global Alliance. As previous speaker just mentioned, the geopolitical tensions have really changed things. And as a company, we are reassessing and reevaluating the setups we have. And I think the private sector can really bring practical insights and innovation to the table. We're not just users of a system. And IKEA, we've contributed to alliance projects that reduce red tape and improve customs procedures. And what's so powerful about this work is it doesn't just benefit us as a large company. They create ripple effects for all businesses, local suppliers, and ultimately also consumers. And looking ahead, I would say I think businesses, when they engage and invest in public-private partnership, such as with the Global Alliance, reforms can really become more grounded and meaningful for all players. But let me also say that we believe collaboration is key. There is no one single player who can make this happen. So togetherness is really important.
Wonderful, and I will pass over now to move over to Ana. Guatemala is a country we have collaborated successfully on a project regarding dematerialization of paperwork within the framework of the port operations. As we look forward to the next decade, what do you see from your perspective as the major trends in terms of technology, environment, economic development, and how are these influences going to affect the work that we're doing in trade facilitation in general?
Thank you, Philip, and thank you, the Alliance, for the invitation with such a distinguished panel. Well, for me, the next decade of trade will be marked by transformation, driven by technology, sustainability, and also regionalization. Technology is reshaping how we trade, or how trade operates, from digital customs, paperless systems, smarter logistics, and data-driven decision-making. And also, if you include emerging innovations such as artificial intelligence is also key in this transformation. On the other hand, sustainability is now the cornerstone of competitiveness. Now, markets are demanding for transparency, ethical sourcing, low carbon production, and many other things. And as global chains evolve, regional integration is playing a growing role in guaranteeing stability and predictability. Trade facilitation most evolve on these shifts as well, becoming more connected, more intelligent, and also more inclusive. By embracing technology, aligning with sustainability goals, fostering also regional cooperation, as was mentioned also by the colleague from IKEA, developing countries can stay ahead of change and shape a more balanced global trading system. Thank you.
Ambassador, let me move over back to you. We heard from Keika with regards to the perspective of the private sector. Earlier on, you mentioned the importance and the realization from governments that you have to work with the private sector. Going forward, how do you see this evolving, especially in relation to ensuring that reform is sustainable? How do you see the Kenyan government's interaction with private sector to make sure that we're able to move this policy forward?
Yeah, thank you. I think private sector drives trade every day. Mm-hmm. Whether you talk about the companies moving goods or managing logistics or bearing the cost of inefficiencies, I think they do a lot. And if we are to actually engage in a meaningful reform, private sector will have to really play a very critical role. They always know where the gaps are. They bring the resources, technology, data that many governments sometimes often lack. And therefore, their contribution insofar as shaping the future becomes very critical. We have had examples in Kenya where the private sector has partnered with the government to be able to drive reforms. The example on point is where the Kenya Revenue Authority in Kenya has had some trainings for traders that are involved in export or manufacturing to really deal with some of the challenges, the processes that are happening normally within the borders. And in a sense, we've also had opportunities to create what we call the green trading approach, which then makes it possible for traders that are involved in environmentally sensitive products being trained to handle that particular trading in a manner that is efficient and really is sustainable as a business practice.
I often say that the private sector, benefits from trade facilitation, but also has a responsibility to take part of this. And Keika, I'll come to you in a minute with the same question. From a government perspective, would you like to see more involvement of the private sector? And are there specific areas where you think the private sector can really help in moving this forward?
Without doubt, we would require the private sector to take the lead role. Like I said, they bring what sometimes is lacking in government. If you talk about the kind of technology that private sector at times are quite ahead of the government and the resources that they come along, it really helps. And many times when you engage with the private sector, you're able then to bring a critical aspect of what I call the ground up sort of reform that becomes realistic in terms of addressing and positioning ourselves in a manner that as a country will be able to be more efficient and really to catch up with the evolution in other spaces, even globally.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Keika, moving over back to you. The private sector today, as I mentioned in the previous session, we have about 50 multinational companies working with us. You know, not all of the companies are as active and dynamic as is IKEA. You know, if you had to, if you speak to your colleagues from other companies, how do you sort of motivate them to be more involved in development?
Well, I think IKEA very much believes that trade is a force of good, and that's why we're so committed to making sustainable products affordable and accessible to the many people. And this means supporting any type of reforms that reduce cost, improve access, and also empower local communities and people. And it's by working in this way, working inclusively with big and small partners and government stakeholders, that we can create a foundation for shared prosperity. And just, this is the kind of future we want to build, an inclusive future with partners like Alliance. And this is why we're happy to be members of Global Alliance. But I think in general, it's this future looking perspective that we have, always thinking long term.
And Anna, you know, in the various countries in which we work around the world, there's about 25 different countries. What we observe is some countries are more natural at bringing government and private sector to work together. In other countries, it's very, very difficult. From a Guatemala perspective, how is that relationship working? And from a government perspective, are there any risks in relation to getting government and private sector working together? As we know, the government has got to protect its citizens, it's got to ensure revenue to government. Private sector has got to protect its investments, it's got to remain profitable. Can you share with us a little bit about, in your country, how this all operates and potentially in the future, how you would like this to improve?
Thank you, Philip. For us, the private sector is essential for our work. Businesses, they face daily challenges, and they can tell us how to be better. So the involvement makes trade facilitation more practical and effective. So for us, bringing in the private sector is very essential. Of course, we have some differences sometimes on how we see the approach of things, but I think if we have in the room the private sector with all the international stakeholders also and the national institutions, we can build sustainable forms of making trade. So that's why also, for example, the public-private partnership like the Alliance demonstrates that inclusive collaboration makes better reforms, makes better trade, and helps countries like Guatemala and developing countries also in general to make sustainable reforms, responsive and competitive to the needs of markets and society.
Ambassador, let me ask you a similar sort of question. So the Alliance was, we collaborated with your government in Kenya with regards to the establishment of the NTFC a couple of years ago, and in particular, how to bring private sector into the National Trade Facilitation Committee. You've mentioned the benefits of collaborating with the private sector, but of course, you know, as I mentioned before, government has got certain responsibilities. Do you see any risks associated to that? And you know, what can we do, or what can you do as a government to make sure that this model works in the future?
Thank you, Philip. I think we cannot wish away the private sector. Their contribution is critical. As government, much as we also have a role to protect the citizens and even the wider legal framework where this particular private sector plays in, our collaboration with private sector is very critical. And we've seen in the collaborations that you have alluded to, where we have been able to partner together in such a manner that then we are performing and engaging in what I would call realistic reforms. One thing that the private sector brings on board sometimes is even the momentum, which many times could be lost when government alone is driving those reforms. So there are not necessarily tensions between government and private sector. I think whenever there's ongoing consultations that target all relevant stakeholders, it becomes a very key driving reform. And the reform themselves will have a far-reaching impact when the private sector really are within the table, when the reforms are being done. And like I said, in Kenya, when the Kenya Revenue Authority undertook to engage the private players in that particular space, we were able to make some reforms that had become very difficult, which previously when the government attempted to undertake, there was a bit of resistance because, of course, the natural anxiety from the private players was what would it mean for their businesses, a justified concern. But when the initiative was started with the support of our partners like the Alliance, the discussions were done, we were able then to get to a point where we're able to read from the same page and we engage in a seamless reform that then has a far-reaching effect and a better embrace from everyone, which becomes more effective in the long run.
Yeah, you mentioned a key point, and that is really at the center of how we operate is the notion of co-creation and public-private dialogue. And I think you're right. If you are able to build a project from the start with government and private sector, you've probably got a lot more chance in succeeding in that reform because everybody has been part of the design. We're coming to an end of the session because time goes by quickly when you're having a nice discussion. I would like to thank you all and KK Online for sharing your insights, and to everyone who's been part of this journey over the past decade. What we've heard today reinforces what makes the Alliance so special, our ability to adapt, to learn, and to keep delivering real impact through collaboration. As we enter our next decade, our mission remains the same, to make trade work better for everyone. We'll continue to generate reform, to strengthen partnerships, and to ensure that trade facilitation remains a key driver of inclusion, sustainability, and shared prosperity. I would like to thank you all for celebrating this milestone with us and for continuing to shape the next chapter of our journey. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip.